Hello and welcome to Virtual Investor Conferences. My name is Eric May, and on behalf of OTC Markets, we're very pleased you have joined us for our next live presentation from Highland Copper Company, Inc. Before I introduce our speaker, a few points to note. Please submit your questions in the question box to the left of the slides. If you are interested in scheduling a meeting with Highland Copper Company, please click on the Schedule Meetings tab found in the platform navigation bar. You'll be able to view the company's availability and submit a meeting request. On a final note, all of today's presentations will be recorded and available for 24/7 replay. At this point, I'm very pleased to welcome Barry O'Shea, Chief Financial Officer of Highland Copper Company, which trades on the OTCQB venture market with the symbol HDRSF and also on the TSXV under the symbol HI. Welcome, Barry.
Thanks very much, Eric. I appreciate the introduction and also for OTC hosting this conference. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to introduce everyone to Highland Copper. I think some assets that fly a little bit under the radar. We have 9 billion pounds of copper in Michigan in the US, a tier one jurisdiction, certainly from our standpoint. And of key importance, one of our two assets has full permits to develop and operate. So really, if you look around, the peer list of companies, certainly in the copper space, I think you'll be hard pressed to find another permitted copper project in a tier one jurisdiction, let alone the US. So here we go. So let me walk through to begin with some of the key strategic advantages from our standpoint. And, I mentioned it at the outset, the US location. Obviously, the US has a high focus on resource independence and focus on domestic copper supply. And I think it really speaks to the fact that there's license to operate in the US and certainly in Michigan. And I'll walk you through that to some degree. And that's endorsed by the fact that we have permits in hand for our Copperwood mine. That's the first of the two mines that we're looking to sequence to build what will be one of the next producers in the base metal space. And I think it's important to point out the resource scale, and I'll walk you through our resource in a little more detail, but we have 9 billion pounds of copper defined, 50 to 60% of it in the M&I category. So a well-defined resource around which we can build a long-lived, large-scale production profile. And I think importantly as well, we've got strong financial backers, some key mining funds in the US in particular. Their confidence has allowed us to move through the exploration and development phases, and we look forward to that ongoing support. So let me address copper to begin with, and particularly, I think most commentators and most investors will know that there is a large supply-demand imbalance globally. What might be a little less known is if you scale into the US specifically, that differential becomes even more pronounced. Looking at the graph on the bottom right, you can see that demand will outstrip supply by a factor of 3 times by 2035, and that's projections put out by S&P in late 2022, so a good current view. And again, what that really tells you is that the US, and acknowledging the focus on resource independence, really needs to build copper and battery metal mines. And you see the focus pushing. And you also see that focus coming from OEMs who are dependent on supply from a domestic perspective. So that helps you understand why the US, we think, is a good location to operate. But now I wanted to look specifically at Michigan. And maybe it's a little lesser known, but Michigan certainly has a rich mining history. Often when people think about mining in the US, obviously they think directly to Arizona and Nevada. But Michigan operated a host of copper mines from the mid-1800s through to the late 1990s. And actually the White Pine mine, which you see on the map here, was one of the last ones that produced up until about 1995. We're looking to bring it back into production. The two assets are 60 kilometers apart, so a considerable opportunity for synergies, and we'll look forward to developing those. But Michigan has some other key advantages. To begin with, we operate on private land as opposed to federal land. And that basically means that we don't need to run through the full federal NEPA process. There is, of course, a very stringent and well-run state process, one in which we had success permitting Copperwood and look forward to have success in permitting White Pine. Michigan is also focused on enticing industry back into the state. I think you'll also know that Michigan has a rich industry generally, certainly big three auto part makers and otherwise. But over the last decade, some of those jobs have been lost. And as a result, Michigan is really incentivizing companies to come back in, certainly companies like ours that are supporting electrification. So we're looking forward as well to going through a funding application with the state to see if there is is or can be some assistance with respect to infrastructure and other employment costs. And I mentioned OEMs. Obviously, on the map, you can see Detroit. Naturally, it would be great if we could also work in downstream supply and really keep all copper inside Michigan. So now that you've had a sense of our jurisdiction, I wanted to hone in now on the two assets. And I think, as I mentioned, they're arguably a little overlooked, both from a scale and the advanced nature perspective of the two assets. And I think importantly, we have a very clear path in 2023. And that distinguishes us again, even from past years where the path was a little less clear. But at this point, we're really ready to move Copperwood through to a construction decision. We've fully permitted the mine in March. So just about 5 or 6 weeks ago, we issued an updated feasibility study demonstrating the economic viability of the project. And now we're looking to go into early works and detailed engineering during 23 to set ourselves up for a construction decision in 2024. It will be about a 2-year construction window, after which we would be producing in 2026. And it's a really nice base of production, 30,000 tons annually copper. That's about 66 million pounds of copper over an initial 11-year mine life, although we do think we have considerable opportunity to extend that mine life. But that's just the first piece of the puzzle as we think about building an overall mining business. White Pine North is the second and certainly larger asset that we have. 40,000 tons annually produced over 21 years. We have several key permits in place as a result of the fact that it was a past producer. And we're working on a joint timeline with the state of Michigan to advance permitting at White Pine North. Our goal would be to have permits there by the end of 2024, and it would allow us to sequence quite seamlessly development of the two mines. So broadly, the goal then is to have 70,000 tons of annual production, 150 to 160 million pounds of copper over a 15 to 20 year mine life, and we'll build into that over the next 5 years. So acknowledging that Copperwood is the first step of the two, I wanted to highlight a few items that we pointed out in the March feasibility study that we've recently issued. Obviously, we articulated the permitted status. Importantly, we increased the inferred tons. And for background, the inferred tons are tons that are not included in the initial 11-year mine life, but allow you to extend mine life as you do infill drilling. So we truly do believe that there's the capacity to have a 15 to 20-year mine life at Copperwood. And also, aside from life of mine extension, some other opportunities to increase the economics. So with the path in place, I think the other key point that I wanted to bring your attention to here is the leverage to copper price. So looking at the bottom table here, and I'll acknowledge we've done our study at $4 copper, so it's the second row from the bottom, and it shows that at $4, there's very robust economics, an 18% return and a 3.5-year payback. But you can also see that as copper price moves from $4 to $4.25 to $4.50, there's meaningful movements each time. There's about a 3 to 4% IRR increase for every 25 cents copper increase. So it really tells you that the project works at current and spot copper prices, but has incredible leverage at higher prices. And I think most people do, certainly people who'd be on a call like this, considering investment in a copper company, agree in the thesis of the supply-demand imbalance and copper prices moving in the right direction. So now let me walk you through the asset base itself. Quality of asset is key to any company around which you build your mines. And when you look at these, you do get a sense of the scale, 3.7 billion pounds of copper at Copperwood. And you can see half of that is in M&I. I referenced that a little bit earlier. So the other half still has the capacity to be drilled to an M&I status and brought in to increase mine life. I'd also point out the nice copper grade of 1.51% at Copperwood. And White Pine, as I mentioned, even the bigger prize, 5.4 billion pounds of copper, about 60% of that sits in M&I and broadly gives rise to a 20-year mine life, one that will really take advantage of copper cycles over the coming decades. And just to give you a little context on valuation, I've also shown you enterprise value to resource per copper pound. Given the scale of our resource and I guess what I would say the modest valuation that we're attracting on the markets at the moment, we're valued at just under 1 cent US per copper pound. And sometimes when you find yourself at the bottom end of this valuation curve, as you see that we do, it can often be to do with the fact that investors have a concern over your jurisdiction, perhaps technical issues of the projects, perhaps permitting. Well, none of those really apply to us. I do honestly think that these assets have been overlooked. They've certainly reached the incentive price at which they will get built. And it's only a matter of time that the market kind of sees what's under the hood at Highland. And obviously, we'd look forward to progressing up that valuation curve. Putting the scale of the resource aside, the next biggest thing is permitting. I think most investors who look at development projects, they need to make something of a binary call on whether or not the mine can get built. We certainly think Copperwood is in that position. It's advanced from an engineering perspective and all permits in place. So it really puts timeline in our hands. So when you think about Highland as an investment, obviously there's the option on copper price increases, but there's also simply the option on the fact that we can take part in a commodity cycle by building this mine in the short term. Not something that a lot of our peers are able to say at this point. And White Pine similarly has 3 of the 7 state permits that it needs. The balance 4 permits we're working on at the moment. We've done environmental baselining, or we're in the process at the moment. We look forward to submitting our permit applications in late 2023, and ideally receiving permits in late 2024. And that approximates the timeline on which we had Copperwood permitted. So we have an element of confidence as we look at that. And I've given you a good idea, I think, of the assets themselves. And now I want to step back a little bit and just think about broadly how we think about our business and how we operate in Michigan and in the US. Naturally, I've pointed out we'll look to mine in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. But we've also done some met test work that has proven that we're capable of producing finished product copper cathode at site. Naturally, we still need to do the economics around that. But what it does tell you is that if we're successful at producing cathode at site, we can then look to downstream supply OEMs and other industry in Michigan. And there is a considerable amount of it. And really what that does is create a nice circle wherein the copper we produce is used in the US, and all jobs and benefits remain in the US and particularly in Michigan. And this view, we think, has been very helpful to bolster our application for funding at the state of Michigan. They like the concept of all of the economic benefit of a project, certainly labor, et cetera, all staying within Michigan. And I think I mentioned we're in a funding application process that we'd look forward to updating the market in the second half of 2023. I had mentioned also critical for companies of our nature, certainly pre-revenue companies, is having financial backers who support and like your assets. And you'll see on here, a list of strong investors, mining equities and funds who have demonstrated support over the past number of years for these projects, assisted us in moving through exploration to development, and now really this next phase, which is moving towards a construction decision. So having these companies, these equities on our register has been critical, certainly for our success, and we look forward to carrying on with that. And a quick look now at the economics. So I had mentioned that Copperwood was done at $4 copper price. I would point out the initial capital of $391 million. What's interesting is that that's certainly an amount of capital that we'll need to solve for from a funding perspective, which I believe that we can. But in terms of global base metal and copper projects around the world, it's actually a relatively small capital figure and strong capital intensity. A lot of the copper porphyry projects you see worldwide are certainly in the $1 billion plus range. So this is a really nice stepping stone into Michigan. It allows us to significantly invest in people and certainly in the area and move through into construction and production. And it gives rise to an 18% IRR. And I think importantly, as you look at leverage to copper price, and I've pointed out a 20% increase in this example, you see some asset values that really show the targets for us that we think we will get both from executing today and also ideally tailwinds from a copper price perspective. And then looking over at White Pine, I think what you'll notice right away, naturally, I've mentioned it's a larger project. As a result, it does have a larger capex, but its scale of NPV or net asset value is also particularly strong. It's a multiple of Copperwood's. So it becomes a very important piece to the valuation of the overall Highland story. Obviously, we'll step from the smaller mine into the larger once we've built our presence in the area. But as we scale up that production profile, you can see that the value of these two assets, both on an undiscounted and discounted basis, really begins to scale meaningfully. And I'll give you a sense, today our enterprise value is in the 35 million range. So you'll see that it gives us a pretty nice target from an asset value perspective to accrete to as we continue to execute. And I'm going to wrap it up on this slide before I take a few questions. Highland Copper has a very clear path through 2023 and beyond. Obviously, we want to move from being a developer into a true copper producer, and we think we have a path to do so. It starts with Copperwood, where we can sustainably build this smaller mine, early site works through this summer, detailed engineering, a construction decision ideally in 2024 that would lead us into production in 2026. Simultaneously, at White Pine North, we're looking to move the permitting process along, advance our studies. We'll look to update that preliminary economic assessment in June of this year, so nicely have a current study out in the market, continue to infill, move to feasibility, and ideally by the end of 2024, have White Pine where we have Copperwood today, allowing us to continue to sequence along our path. And we think we also have some nice corporate catalysts as well. I think I've given you some good background on the funding application that we have with the state. We think that will really, bolster obviously the economics of the project, but it will be a real endorsement from the state, not to mention having permits in hand. We're also going to continue to work towards downstream relationships with the OEMs. Having that supply relationship directly obviously creates a wonderful story inside Michigan. It's a wonderful ESG story, another component of the strategy that we'll look to develop over the next period of time. So I hope I've given you a good sense that Highland has some assets at an advanced stage of permitting and of engineering, that we have a path to move from being a developer into a producer. And there's certainly plenty of value in the company should you consider to invest. So with that, let me take a look at some of the Q&A. I'll handle those, and then we'll wrap up once we've been through a few. So our first question, is your position to operate the mine or look for an operating partner or sell the collective asset? And that's a good question. Obviously, in some instances, developers are looking more for a path to sell the company at a point. That's not necessarily the case for us. I will note that our CEO, his name is Denis Miville-Deschênes. He spent the last 30 years building mines with Cambior and IM Gold. He truly is a mine builder and developer, and we think we have the capacity internally to build Copperwood and advance onto White Pine. That being said, arguably from a funding perspective, there may be a need for a partner along the way, and certainly something that we can consider. But specifically, as we look to Copperwood, that's an asset of a scale that we think we can finance and build internally. Another question here. Can you access any government funds or IRA incentives for a new mine? So I think I've probably articulated reasonably well the state funding piece, and that's certainly something that we think or I should say, we'd hope to have success with. There are also plenty of federal funds, but I will acknowledge that at the moment, copper is not yet on the critical minerals list. There's plenty of lobbying going on, both from a political and I'd say from an industry perspective, to get copper put on that list. I think that will be successful in the coming year. As and when that happens, that will open copper projects up for some of the other federal incentives that are available. And if that is the case, we will certainly take a look at that. Let's see here. Can you speak to your capital position with regards to your 23 and 24 initiatives? Yeah, absolutely. So in 2023, obviously we have some early site works to do. We have cash to begin those works. We have about 10 million US in the bank, so we're nicely funded. Arguably, though, we would look at raising cash at some point in 2023, depending on the scale of the initiatives that we have. 2024, obviously, is a slightly different story. If we're looking to make a construction decision, we would need to look at how we're going to fund the broader initial capital cost of the project. And maybe I'll give you a brief sense about how we think about that. Of the 390 million needed for that project, we think about 50 to 60% of it would come through a debt package. And, we would run a pretty robust debt process to look at banks that provide debt into the markets, as well as other private mining private equities. There's asset financing available. There's offtake available. And then certainly beyond that, there's going to be an equity component. And we believe that will be available to us, assuming the other pieces of the execution path roll into place. So another good question, or what would be the main challenges in regards to social acceptability for the two projects? So, I guess the first thing I'd point out and remind you is that these projects are in a historic mining district, and it's one of those areas that you'll understand, families have a history, fathers and brothers and mothers have worked at the mines in the past. So there's certainly a nostalgia for the mine. Obviously, that's not the only thing needed for support, but it is a good starting point. Obviously having state support is critical. And broadly then, outside of that, I guess what I would say is through the application process at Copperwood, all other stakeholders have an opportunity to be heard. And the state certainly heard from a range of groups of interest. Broadly speaking, I would say that there is acceptance for the project. Naturally, there's always some noise, as there will be, and the state hears concerns out and consults appropriately. And in the case of Copperwood, proceeded with permitting, and we would hope that to be the case with White Pine as well. And so with that looks like it's the end of the questions. Really appreciate everybody taking the time. I hope you've seen that there's a good value proposition here in Highland. There are some real assets, some scaled and scalable resource base to move into a production profile with. So as mentioned, always happy to take further questions and naturally happy to meet at other times as needed.